Okay, hello Amsterdam. How are you doing? Really excited to be here another year. Yeah, sorry. Thanks for the presentation. The only thing I need to add is if you want to find me online, just search Buzz on Twitter or esm.dev on Blue Sky, and that I live in Paris, where I organize the meetup, the VueJS Paris meetup. So if you come across Paris and you want to give a talk, give me a call or a message. And today, I want to talk about Pinia Colada, which is a library I have been working for the past year, a bit less, I think, which is a refreshing approach to async state management. I want to show you how to use it to improve the UX. But before, I want to talk a little bit about history of UX. So I want to go a few years back, or more like a few thousand years back, okay? So when we think about UX, it's still a very modern term. But the concept itself existed for a very long time in different scenarios, in different contexts. So we're more talking about ergonomics in the past. And the first time we see this kind of concept arise is in ancient China. We call this feng shui. So you might have heard about this in some YouTube videos about how to position your bed in your bedroom. This is not about that. But the phrase, or I don't have one sentence to describe this because it's very ancient, so probably there is just not one version of it. But it says so. The best space is one in which the arrangement of objects is aligned with the space flow of energy, which is a fancy way of saying make a space that is harmonious and feels functional. So the idea here is, of the ergonomics, is that we are focusing on the space. Okay? How does it feel to be in it? And if we go a little bit further in history, so Hippocrates, is always hard to say that in English, which is known as the father of medicine, and played a major role in the way tools are designed, also workspaces. And he said, when describing the surgeon workplace, that tools must be positioned in such a way as to not obstruct the surgeon, and also be within easy reach when required. They must be close to the surgeon operating hand. So the idea here is not about the space and how it's ergonomic. It's more about how the space revolves around the user. So we come from a flow in the space and how we feel, kind of like a vibe, in the space, to a workspace and a user-centric approach. And I think this gets interesting. So the idea here is not about how everything feels, but how a user, in this case a surgeon, feels. So it's specific to the task. And I think that's important. If we go a little bit further, we have Henry Dreyfus, which was an industrial designer in 1955, that said, so this one is a bit long, if the point of contact between the product and people becomes a point of friction, then the designer has failed. If, on the other hand, people are made safer, more comfortable, more desirous of purchase, more efficient, or just plain happier by contact with the product, then the designer has succeeded. And I think this is getting way closer to UI. At the same time, it's not that long ago. The whole idea of feng shui and Hippocrates with workspace are quite abstract. And you might be wondering, how to apply these to web? And I just want you to be a little bit patient because it's going to take a little bit of time. But there is an interesting concept here, is that in the other versions, we were talking about how to create something great, how to make something good. Here, we are facing for the first time the negative counterpart. So we are kind of opposing friction with the flow and how to iterate over something. And I think this is important because nowadays, when we create applications, we iterate a lot over it. And so we have a chance to improve things as they evolve. I know I'm being a little abstract, so I'm not going to get too much into the history, but I cannot go through when was the term coined. The term UX was coined on 1993 by Don Norman. I think he was working at Apple at the time. And so he says, I thought human interface and usability were too narrow. I wanted to cover all aspects of the person's experience with a system, including industrial design, graphics, the interface, the physical interaction, and the manual. So There is a lot more to UX history. By the way, it's a very interesting topic. I completely skipped very important parts. If you want to know about it, search history of UX. You're going to find a lot of interesting articles and research papers as well. But going back to the point of friction, what creates friction and makes a failed design, I want to talk about browsers. When you think about a browser, the main point of contact is the URL. And in a way, it's already friction right away. So let's take a simple example, a static website with no JavaScript. The first thing we do is we visit the website, and then we wait. I did slow down a little bit in network request. And things appear, so on, so on. But I want you to notice something. How did you feel when you see this website? How do you feel when you see it loading? So already, who knows this website? Can you raise your hand? So kind of like the half, or maybe no, maybe 25%. Now I want you to say, who had a positive feeling? Now I know this is very abstract, but just when you saw this website, you felt great, you felt good. A little bit less. Now who had, you can have neutral, okay? Who had a negative feeling when seeing the website? And a bit more than who had a positive feeling. And so this is one of the points I want to show, and this that relates to the flow. All these things are subjective, okay? It depends on, well, when were you born, what you lived. The positive can come from nostalgia as well. In a way, can come from, it's similar to the halo effect, where in the case of interfaces, there are studies that show that because you have a good looking UI, the people are going to form an opinion very quickly, even before using the application. And they're going to think the application is more trustworthy and just more intuitive because it looks better. And the funny thing is that the study shows that people form an opinion in the first 50 milliseconds when the application loads. But, well, most of the time the JS hasn't even loaded. So they haven't used your application. And using the application looks a little bit like this in the static context, of course. You navigate a little bit, and every single navigation is going to create some delay, some kind of friction. Did we fail if we compare to Henry Dreyfus? Not exactly, right? I'm playing a little bit with the words here. But the idea is I'm showing you the static website because I don't need to show you an application of a web app that you use. Probably you use them every day. And you've probably come across frustration, okay, when you have this friction. And it doesn't really come from the wait time, although it can come from the wait time. It comes from the incertitude of what is going to happen. Is it going to error? Is it going to break at this point? Did I do anything wrong? Do I need to start all over again? So that's the part that interested me, because aesthetics are subjective, and, well, you just hire a better designer if you want, or if you are a good designer yourself, you can design your website and spend some time on it. But what matters more here is how do we manage this loading state, the errors, and make everything consistent so that the user feels safe. And you can say that data fetching is easy. So this would be like the simple version of data fetching in Vue. It's just a wait instead of unmounted. You can also use suspense, blah, blah, blah. But the main issue with this version is that we don't have any indication of loading. And this is where problems start, okay? Of course, you can say, hey, I'm just going to use suspense and put a skeleton UI there. Now, skeletons UI, for those who don't know, are these little gray boxes that look like your UI. So they are meant to avoid layout shift, and they give your user an impression of, okay, I know what is going to appear in the screen. But there is an issue with this when it doesn't work. So this pattern in particular is very interesting because it has been overused, in my opinion. Now, the main point is when things go well. But what about when things go wrong? And when everybody is using the same pattern? What happens is that the users are going to associate the wrong times they have and be like, oh no, again, this skeleton UI. I don't know if this happens to you, but it happens to me. When the skeleton UI stays up for too long, I start to stress, like, shit, am I going to have to book my flight all over again? And so the bottom line of all these, what do we do? What do we do to reduce this risk? One very simple conclusion is we need to reduce the wait time to keep the user in flow, to keep everything fluid. How do we do that? We can make our async operation faster. You can move to Rust, whatever you want. But this is not what we're going to cover today, obviously. We can start them sooner. And I think this should start to ring a bell to some of you. And we can also make them feel faster, because this is going to be the most interesting part, is the feeling. In the end, what matters is how the user feels, not the actual numbers, although the actual numbers are correlated, of course. So today I want to focus on these 2 points with Pinia Colada. But I cannot go over without explaining what Pinia Colada is. So just a little show of hand. Who has heard about Pinia Colada? Okay, so my spamming is working. And who has used it? Great, more than I expected. So hopefully the experience is not too bad. It should be even better with time. Pinia Colada is a small layer on top of Pinia. It's a Vue plugin. And it has a few components or a few parts, because component is a little bit different in Vue context. We have a cache, a query cache, which is actually a Pinia store. We have queries that we define with useQuery and define query, and we have mutations. Now, the difference between these two is that a query is any operation that reads asynchronously. So it doesn't have to be just the GET request. It can also be a POST, for example, a search. But basically, it's anything that lists, search, or detail data from the server. And mutations are kind of the opposite. Any operation that can write to the data on the server. We're going to see that they're quite connected, and this is the biggest part where we can improve things. And we also have, and it's also light and extensible. So I like libraries which are light. That's why the router is also very light, like 6 kilobytes. Pinia is 1.5, and this is about 3 kilobytes. But we have an extensible API that is pretty nice, and it's going to be very important. So let's start by talking about queries in the simplest form. So this is just having variables to show that we're loading and that we have errors, which we probably already have in many cases. The queries are going to be the most important part. And we have two required parameters. One is the key. The key is going to tell where do we store the data, the state, the error related to this query in the query cache. And then the query is just going to be the function that returns the promise of the data. Now, among all we have all the things, of course, but the most important parts are going to be the state, which is going to contain the error, is it pending, and the data, and the async status, so every time it reloads. Because one of the interesting things is that it automatically refetches when needed. And then we can use this information whatever we want. The important part is that we have a very low-level access, so we can check if the status is loading. Usually we have the error first. If there is an error, we want to display it in a way or another, ideally a way to recover, which I'm completely going over here. Then we have the data, and if you really want to, you can display a skeleton. I wouldn't combine the loading with the skeleton, but just for the example. Now, what is exactly this state? State is actually a union of 3 different states, and we have 3 different properties. So we have the status, the data, and the error. And based on what status we are on, we have a discriminated union in TypeScript. So that's why it's useful, because depending on what you check for the status, you know that data and the error are going to have a certain shape. Now, I don't need to go into the details of these. I think most of the information you can figure it out pretty quickly. But there is a lot more to get from the queries. So the same way you have this state, we also have individual access to the properties of the data, the status, and the error. This is because they map well to the way we define a template, and this is important when you are expressing your HTML. You want to have something that is connected to your data very directly, so you don't have to create too many computers in between. On the surface, this seems like very simple, right? We also have these 2 functions, refresh and refetch. But what's interesting is that we can call these in any places we want, the use query in any components we want. But because we have the key that is the same, we're going to have a shared data, kind of like a shared store among them. And so that means that no matter how many times we call refresh, we're just going to have one call because we did them close enough. In fact, the promise returned by refresh is going to be the same if they happen very closely. So this is going to simplify things a lot, because very often you have the query, the data being used in multiple places, but you want to update it at the same time because you know, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And you don't want to worry about, do I have a part that is not consistent? Did I change my profile picture, but it didn't change on the navbar? Did I mess up something? And so this inconsistent part is one of the, in my opinion, one of the parts that also makes your user lose trust. Because if you don't know if your data updated and you see things different, then you're not trusting the application anymore. So this is where the centralized data come in, and this is where we can get into the query cache. The query cache gives us access to any entries we want. And when I say access, we have access to a lot of information. And when I say a cache, people often think, isn't the cache about doing less requests? Well, in the case of a client-side cache, it's not the case. When you're on the server, yes, you want to have a layer of server with a cache that prevents the server from running too many requests, and you just have a fast, close to the user data center. On client side, I would say the role is actually the opposite. You want to do more requests, but you want to do them at the right time. And the power comes from knowing locally when was the last time you fetch. Is this data up to date from my knowledge? And so we're going to automatically trigger the refetches. And because we have this connection between the components that can act upon some data, having this centralized place, which is the query cache, somewhere, and being able to say, hey, this data changed, and it will automatically refresh everything behind the scenes, that's what makes it interesting and easy to just focus on the data and the operations you need and adapt your interface to it. So the query cache is accessible like this. So it's a store. So it's use query cache. It can be a query client. The name doesn't really matter too much, honestly. And as any other cache, we have a concept of fresh and stale data. And this concept is going to be very important because every operation we do is going to revolve around this. Okay? So fresh data means the data is up to date. I don't need to fetch it again. I can just display it, and it should be more or less up to date. It doesn't have to be 100% precise, and this is also important. If it's outdated for 5, 10, 15 seconds, most of the time it's fine. But you can also force this if you need to. Stale data, on the other hand, is when the data needs to be refetched. It doesn't mean that we are immediately refetching, okay? When data is stale, the store knows that it has to be refetched the next time it's needed. And you can tell it to do it at any time, and that's the important part. So you will notice also that query doesn't have an argument, because otherwise it wouldn't be able to call it automatically. And you can customize how long the data is fresh in the store. By default, it's 5 seconds, but you can change it globally. The idea is that very often you go to a page, you go back, and you don't want to refresh the same information. And this is also useful when you have authenticated sessions, because a cache usually cannot store, or you shouldn't store, authenticated information on the cache, because it's shared. But locally, you can. So you avoid doing another request and showing any kind of transition between pages. You can just go back immediately, which is great. For example, useQuery automatically triggers a refetch if stale when we focus the web page. So if the user went to another place and they come back, we automatically refresh, so only if needed, and when we mount a component that calls useQuery on the data. But how is this better? And I want to tell you a little bit small story. There is an airport in Houston. It was in the 90s. And people were feeling a lot of complaints about the wait times for luggage, the baggage claim. And the way it goes is, in that time, the people arrive by plane, they take 1 minute to go to the baggage claim, and they wait 7 minutes. That's the story for the luggage claim. Now, 7 minutes, it's very, very short, I would say. I've waited only 7 minutes. Most of the time it's half an hour in Paris, but whatever. And they were filling complaints right away because the place to fill complaints was also very close. So what do they do? They move the plane, the arrival, to be 6 minutes or 7 minutes away from the baggage claim. So people would just spend 7 minutes walking to the baggage claim and just spend 1 minute getting the luggage. And so like, yeah, this is so fast. But in reality, they were tricked. And I'm sorry to let you know this, but most of the time we're just tricked by the applications into believing that the experience is great. Not always, but very often. How does this apply to websites even? The idea is that the perception of speed is way more important than speed, and that sometimes it takes tricking the user into, or just keeping them busy for some time to make them feel like things are faster. But I wouldn't apply it so lightly. I like to refer to these response times, which comes from a study from Jacob Nielsen in 1993. This study reveals that anything that takes less than 100 milliseconds is exactly the same as instant. For the user, it's as if no time elapsed. So you shouldn't show any loading at all for less than 100 milliseconds, 0. Under 1 second, the user stays in their flow of thought. So they know what they are doing. They are not thinking about something else. Oh, what was that? The bed? Where should I position in my room? They keep thinking about, okay, I'm buying something. Should I use my business card, my personal card? So under 1 second, you don't always need to show a loading spinner. Okay? Where is a little bit more tricky. And under 10 seconds, you need to tell the user that you're loading. But over 10 seconds, you have to know that they're probably going to context switch. They're going to probably open the social media on the side. They're going to open the email, stuff like that. So in these scenarios, it's very, very important to tell the user that something is happening, and it might take time. And you might be thinking, my API is never going to take 10 seconds to respond. What you're talking about? Well, until you introduce the AI, and you have a LLM trying to figure out some response for 10 seconds. And it's going to happen. Times are going to go shorter, but responses over 10 seconds are not that uncommon nowadays. So one of the ways we can do this with Pinia is actually very simple. We delay spinners. It's not out of the box, because we don't want to have this impact everybody. But there is a Pinia Colada plugin, so it's a plugin for the plugin. I know it's funny. But we just specify the amount of milliseconds we want to delay. And there are studies that show that you can delay the spinner up to 400 milliseconds. The idea is that don't show the user that you're loading until you know you're really loading, okay? And so they will believe things are very fast. You can try this yourself. Delay a loading in your own application by 400 milliseconds, and you will see how it feels instant. It feels like, oh, it didn't wait at all. On the other hand, if you have this spinner flash, that's so bad, because this flash of something really captures the attention of the user. And so they're probably going to be like, oh, what happened? And I need to talk also about mutations, because I'm talking about the queries a lot, and it's very important because it's the information we show. But the place where we create friction the most is not when we read data. Most of the times, there are no errors when we read the data. Most of the times, the errors come from mutations, when we change something. And so mutations are very simple in Pinia Colada. We just need a function. And this time, we can take arguments. We can pass anything we want, because we cannot execute automatically a mutation. We have to trigger it manually. And we have access to the same state on queries, so it's consistent. You can use the same abstractions to show some loading or graying out stuff, etc., etc. So the key is to use them both together. But how? When you use a mutation, most of the time, you know what your user is going to do afterwards, right? This is case-based case, but if a person updates their profile, they probably want to see their profile updated. If a person posted something, you probably want, let's talk Blue Sky, Twitter, blog, they probably want to see their blog appearing, or the tweet, or whatever. So a very simple thing you can do, without changing the logic at all of your application, is invalidating the query. Now, the reason this is interesting is because mutations and query do not always exist in the same place of your code. So it's very annoying if you had to connect the two things together. Having this centralized version of the cache allows you to tell the store, hey, invalidate these queries. So for example, I updated a contact. I know that the contact list is no longer up to date. You probably need to refetch it. And the contact with the ID I just changed is also not up to date anymore. So update that as well. And the store is going to mark the data as stale. And if they are being used somewhere, it's going to refetch them. You can also force, of course, the refetch by passing an option, but the idea is that you know the flow of your application. You know and you can track, you can have analytics on what the users do. Try to do that to start fetching before. It's just prefetching in a way, okay? Except that prefetching is usually connected to loading a page and stuff like that. But you can also apply it for mutations. So when you change data, you can prefetch what the user is going to look for. If you know that users go to the home page afterwards or to a search page, just charge that instead, okay? So predicting the future is, it's a fancy name, but we can even do better. So what we know already is prefetching, right? But can we even go into the future? And the answer is we can. We can do optimistic updates. Now, this is a very long topic, so I'm going to go a little bit fast over it, but know that documentation is quite extensive on the Pinia Colada. I want to show you a little demo. And I cannot run that into an iframe, so I need to just do it here. So this is Attidon. So this is a Next application where I implemented the optimistic updates. And so the way it works is that when I adding a to-do, I'm sending the information to the server, and I know what the server is going to reply back. So I don't wait for the server to tell me what is the new data. I just update it locally and still get the new data. I optimistically know, I know what's the good outcome of this operation. So if I type very fast, I can add as many to-dos as I want. Now, never mind the toast. That's a very bad practice. I already told Sebastian a lot about it, but he insists on keeping them. Now, if I make the cache slow, I just deleted everything, and you can see the toast. This is why the toasts are really bad. They come afterwards. So I could still interact with the application as if it was instant, because most of the time, things are going to work, right? So you need to optimize a little bit for this optimistic path. That's going to make your application feel much better. And here you're going to see that adding things are a little bit different. You see how they are grayed out? You still want to give the user feedback if you know that your application, for example, is going to be used a lot on the subway, and that you know that you're going to have a flaky connection. Because in that case, you know your audience, you know the context in which they use your application, and you know that they are going to delay some of their operations. Graying out is one technique, by the way. You can also use a loading spinner. Just consider that showing a loading spinner somewhere can also drive users' attention to it, while graying out is a little bit more subtle, and it doesn't necessarily drive that much attention. Okay, going back to the, let me remove the mouse there. This is the code for the mutation. Now, it's a bit long, and I don't have much time left, so I'm going to go over a little bit quick. The mutation is pretty much the same. But then we have these hooks. These hooks are going to run before and after the mutation. So first thing we do is on mutate is when the mutation is triggered. And what we do is that we clear out the input immediately so the user can keep adding new to-dos. We get the current version of the data, and we patch it with the new version. So that's the get query data and then send query data. Then we cancel any ongoing queries, because we know that if there was any query that was already fetching this information, it's going to get an outdated version of the to-dos. So there is no point in keeping them. And then we return this information so we can use them in the other hooks. For example, the success. If the success happens, we can, I don't need to do this, but we can replace the data locally with the version that was sent to the by the server. When we settle, so both rejections and success, we invalidate the queries, so we want to still get a fresh version of the server. We want to make sure that we have correct data. Is important. And if we error, this is the big chunk, we need to roll back. Okay, so this is the most complicated part, in my opinion, about optimistic updates, is that you need to handle the rollback. It's not that much code. It's still, in my opinion, sometimes better to have more code than a convention, because depending on how you work with project, the more conventions you have, when you come back to the project after a few months of working something else, you're going to be like, where does this import come from? And it's going to create a new set of new problems that are really annoying. And the last part is also, yeah, this is the interesting part, is the rollback. If the information change and our version on the cache is the one that is still there, we know that it's no longer up to date. If it's something else, it means that some other mutation changed it, so we don't want to update that. And I'm going really fast again, but it's a very interesting topic, and as you saw with the demo, it really creates amazing experience, no matter the connection. So how does it work? Another big chunk of code, I know. The query cache is a Pinia source, so we can use on action. A lot of people forget that Pinia is not just DevTools and a cute logo. We also have a very nice plugin API. We have an action that allows you to just, based on any action and is fully typed, do something. And so the query cache has a lot of actions that allows you to kind of hook into the events as if they were events. And so you can, for example, create new properties that you add into the query, and these are returned by the use query. So for example, isDelaying is a property that we have access to when we call use query. And we can even override the properties that exist in the entry that are native, like async status, data, etc., etc. And also fully type safe, of course. You can add options. You can add properties type in a type safe version. There is a lot more, but I want to recap a little bit what this Pinia Colada is a tool that avoids, so things you should remember and that are easy to do with Pinia is you can avoid showing loading state too quickly, and you should definitely do this. This is a very quick win in your applications. Just try it for yourself and you will see that is much better. Using centralized data allows you to have consistent state across your application, and it's very, very important. Invalidating queries as soon as you know that a new version is ready, because this is the equivalent of prefetching, but also for updates on your data. And use optimistic updates to make the application feel faster, because the perception of speed is always better than the speed itself, even though it's correlated. And get creative. The reason I'm talking about Feng Shui and Hippocrates, and I have other examples like the elevators and these interactive floor maps for the kids in the malls. Touch grass sometimes. It's nice to get some inspiration from real-world things, because we are in a digital era where the interfaces are a lot touch-based or mouse, but a lot of the context from physical world still applies. And the wait times are still the same, right? And the flows of things, the distance between things still looks a lot like real life. So sometimes I think it's interesting to look into other things, like for example, video games with another example, level of detail, and they have other things. The loading spinners are more playful. So you know your audience, you know the flow of your application. There is no silver bullet, okay? Sorry to break it to you. There are a few things that are really can be applied everywhere, but reducing friction with async state is really a consistent way to improve the UX. And improving the UX of your application is going to drive more users to your application, make them buy more things if that's the point of your application, etc., etc. Sorry for it being too long, and thank you for having me.